Is there more than one way to express affection for a subject? The 1950s is one such example of a subject that finds expression, fandom, in distinct ways. On the one hand, there is the mainstream nostalgic image, born not during the 1950s itself, but during the 1970s, with TV shows such as Happy Days, Laverne and Shirley, and the Sha Na Na Variety Show, that band being one of several 1970s 50s nostalgia bands, along with Flash Cadillac and the Continental Kids, that thrived during the disco and hard rock dominated 1970s. Of course, there was also the movies. American Graffiti, actually set in 1962, but since the early 1960s is essentially a continuation of 1950s cultures, that film was instrumental in sparking a wave of nostalgic, carefree 1970s comedies set in the post-war era, including The Lords of Flatbush and the 1978 film adaptation of Jim Jacobs and Warren Casey's local Chicago stage play turned Broadway sensation, Grease. We've already covered how the 1971 stage version and the hugely successful and iconic 1978 film version differed, and why they differed in a previous video. But in short, the 1978 Grease movie, along with the other nostalgic representations of the 1950s, born during the 1970s, created images that are still with us today, at least in the mainstream, when referencing the 50s, in order to sell diner menu items, Halloween-themed costumes, party favors, and oldies collections of the most remembered mainstream hits. Usually of the type that Dick Clark would have promoted 2 decades before, songs that even the most uninterested normie who knows nothing of 50s rock and roll would be familiar with. The overriding theme for mainstream 50s nostalgia is return to a time before riots, before drugs, before serious crimes, where all you had to worry about was having enough money for your date to the drive-in on a Saturday night. And that selling point makes sense when we consider that 50s nostalgia of the 1970s came on the heels of the end of the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, the Manson murders, and campus riots. But even as that somewhat sugar-coated and sanitized version of the 50s was used by the mainstream to both sell things and ease the pain from the Vietnam War, another, more underground movement, a fandom for the more rarer, harder-edged 1950s rock and roll music was underway. This movement eschewed the costume party stereotype of mainstream nostalgia, embraced 1950s rock and roll recordings that did not make Dick Clark's top 10, and communicated with like-minded 1950s fans through independently published, and sometimes even stapled together, fanzines. These 50s fandom fanzines discussed rare rock and roll, 1950s teen exploitation movies, teen pulp novels, and to illustrate just how different this approach to 1950s youth culture was from mainstream nostalgia, would often include actual, real-life, true crime stories of 1950s era youth crime cases. Some fanzines even focused exclusively on JD, or juvenile delinquent content. At this point, a mainstream casual fan of something like 1978's Grease might be wondering, why would you want to study that if you love the 1950s? I want to escape from today's troubles by going back to the 1950s. Oftentimes, these statements are accompanied with, we didn't have troubles, and none of our generation made trouble, not like the kids today. We certainly didn't have violent crime, drugs, and attacks on the young and the old the way you do today. Where did it all go wrong? A member of this alternate approach to 1950s fandom, a member of the rockabilly subculture, or a vintage lifestyle enthusiast, having been weaned on fanzines such as Continental Restyling, Martin Heaphy's and Steve Palfrey's Rumble, or Miriam Linna's Kicks and Bad Seed fanzines, could theoretically counter, why would you normies want to candy up the 1950s and make it seem laughable and unimportant? Or conversely, why would you deny reality and facts when there were things like violent crime, crimes against young innocents and vulnerable older adults, and drugs? We want to see how 1950s society dealt with real human problems, which you seem to deny. And there lies the source of occasional heated discussions on 1950s discussion groups on various social media platforms. It's partly based on how many remember the 1950s, as opposed to how rockabilly and vintage culture fans research the 1950s. And it's honestly a bit of a generation gap. There are many factors that influence these differences, from psychological studies of how we, as human beings, filter memories of the past, to the historical fact that lamenting the past and criticizing the young goes back to antiquity. Even Plato in ancient Greece did it. While working on the next episode of our 1950s True Crime series, an episode that explores the August 23, 1959 gang war on Manhattan's Lower East Side, at the behest of fellow researcher Kwame Welsh, I asked senior citizens of appropriate age who grew up as young people during the 1950s about the very stories of 1950s real-life youth crime that I was introduced to in Miriam Linna's, Steve Palfrey's, and Martin Heaphy's 50s fanzines. We wanted to see if there was a cultural factor that was also at work. And before we go any further, this interview will also be included in that upcoming episode. I also have to thank these particular seniors, as they are personal friends who I work with when teaching seniors fitness, my real job when not doing YouTube videos. Here are their responses. Did teenagers in the 50s generally pay attention to the news, yes or no?
No.
Yeah.
Nobody paid attention. And it's stuff that I know. Especially if it wasn't in your area. That's right. You know, I mean, maybe you heard what was happening in your neighborhood, but not anything beyond that. No. We were just interested in dancing, and going to proms, you know, that kind of thing. I think.
Listen to the news on the radio, and the TV wasn't pretty well non-existent.
That's true. Absolutely. They don't read the paper.
When you recall the post-war era, the late 40s, 50s, and early 60s, do you go by personal memories or do you go by research? Little bit.
You call it research.
Yeah.
It's just glancing at articles and go, okay, and moving on.
Yeah.
That's kind of how it was done.
Personal memories. I mean,
I'd say personal.
Yeah, definitely. Just my memories, right?
Yeah, some personal memories as well.
Yes.
If we say a name like Cape Man, does that mean anything to you?
No.
Yeah. Michael Farmer, does that name mean anything to you? But if we say a fictional movie like Rebel Without a Cause,
Oh, yeah.
of course, you know.
or West Side Story, that means something to you. If we say Forsyth Street Boys, Sportsmen, or even Los Gavilanes, which was in San Francisco.
Those I know.
So most of you were here in the Tri-City, or
No, San Francisco and the Peninsula.
San Francisco.
Connecticut, San Francisco,
Missouri.
Missouri. Okay,
Canada.
Canada.
You asked me to be here.
Okay. For those of you in San Francisco, do the terms Bart's, white shoes, or Muns, or Pachucos mean anything?
Pachucos and white shoes. Pachucos and white shoes.
Okay.
Pachucos, but that's the only one I can recall.
Cool.
Bops means nothing to you, right? Yeah.
Is that a dance?
It's called a bop.
It's called a bop.
The bop is a dance, a bop is a gang member. Yeah, okay. Cool, cool.